At 11:47 at night, Amara Vale heard her husband's car pull out of the driveway, and the sound settled into the house like a stone dropped into still water. 3 hours earlier, Gideon had walked out of dinner without finishing his wine, and she had told herself it was nothing more than one of his moods, the kind that passed as quickly as it arrived. But when the heavy scrape of something being dragged across the garage floor reached her through the ceiling, she understood that nothing about that night had been ordinary. She went downstairs in her bare feet, the marble cold beneath her, and found a black suitcase sitting behind his workbench, as though it had always belonged there. Her name was written across the top in block letters, Amara Vale, and the lock beneath it was smeared with blood that had not yet dried. It was his blood. She knew that the way a wife knows the smell of her husband's cologne, without needing to be told, and her hands were shaking before she even reached for the handle. Inside, someone had left a single photograph, a cheap burner phone, and a note folded twice, and addressed to her in handwriting she recognized instantly. It read only that if Gideon came home, she was not to open the door. Amara stood there a long moment, the garage light humming above her, and felt the strange sensation of a marriage she had trusted for 8 years, quietly rearranging itself into something she no longer recognized. She turned the note over, searching for more, and found a second line pressed so lightly into the paper that she almost missed it. It warned her not to trust the person wearing a wedding ring like her own. She looked down at the gold band on her finger, the one Gideon had slid onto her hand 8 years earlier in a garden full of white roses, and for the first time in her marriage, she was afraid of it. The evening had begun the way most of their evenings began. With candles, Gideon insisted on lighting himself and a bottle of wine he chose without asking what she preferred. Their house was large and handsome, and cold in the particular way that money sometimes made a home. Every surface gleaming, every object arranged with a precision that left no room for accident. They had been married nearly 8 years and had no children, a fact Gideon rarely mentioned, and Amara had long stopped trying to explain to people who asked. He was a man who controlled everything around him with an ease that used to feel like protection: her schedule, their finances, even the small circle of people he decided she should trust. And for years, she had mistaken that control for love. During dinner, she noticed him glance at his phone 3 times before it finally lit up with a message that changed his face entirely. He stood so quickly his chair scraped against the floor, and when she asked what was wrong, he told her only that he had something to deal with, offering nothing more, as though the question itself was an inconvenience. He left before finishing his meal, and at the door he turned back and looked at her for longer than felt natural, the way a man looks at something he is not sure he will see again. She thought, for one absurd moment, that he might apologize, might explain, might finally let her pass the wall he had built around himself years ago. Instead, he told her that if anyone came to the door that night, she was not to open it, and then he was gone, his car pulling away into the dark at 11:47, leaving her alone with a bottle of wine going warm on the table and a silence that felt, for the first time in years, dangerous rather than merely lonely. She sat alone at that long table for nearly an hour afterward, staring at the empty chair across from her, trying to locate the exact moment their marriage had turned into something she managed, rather than lived inside. There had been a time, early on, when Gideon's need to arrange every detail of their life had felt like devotion, the kind of attention other women envied at dinner parties, the husband who remembered every date, who handled every difficulty before she even knew it existed. It had taken years for her to notice that his care had a shape to it, a boundary that never let her see behind it, and that every problem he solved for her was a problem she was never given the chance to understand on her own. She thought of the friends who had slowly drifted away over the years, not through any single argument, but through 100 small redirections, dinners rescheduled, weekends restructured, until the only person left standing consistently beside her was the man who had just walked out without an explanation. Sitting there in the quiet, she found herself wondering, not for the first time, but with a new and unwelcome clarity, whether the isolation had ever truly been an accident, or whether it had simply been another room in the house Gideon had built around her, one with walls so gradual she had never felt them close. Amara did not open the suitcase right away. She stood in the garage for nearly 10 minutes, studying the space around it, searching for some sign that a stranger had broken in and left it there. But the garage door was locked from the inside, the windows undisturbed, and there was no sign that anyone but Gideon had been in that room. Slowly, the truth settled over her, colder than the concrete beneath her feet. The suitcase had not been thrown there in a panic. It had been placed with care, positioned exactly behind the workbench where she would eventually find it, as though her husband had planned this discovery down to the hour. She called his phone and got nothing, not even a ring, only the flat mechanical voice telling her the number was unreachable. She stood holding the phone to her ear, long after the call had failed, trying to remember the last time Gideon had truly surprised her, and could not think of a single instance in 8 years. That, more than the blood, more than the note, was what frightened her most. She circled the garage twice more, checking the side door, the small window above the sink Gideon used to rinse paintbrushes, the seam where the automatic door met the concrete, and found every point of entry exactly as it should have been, locked, undisturbed, entirely ordinary. Whoever had brought that suitcase into the house had not needed to force their way inside, because they had already possessed a key. She searched his toolbox out of instinct rather than logic, and found, tucked beneath a folded rag, a small brass key that fit the lock on the suitcase as though it had been made for no other purpose. Her fingers hovered over it for a moment before she picked it up, some old, careful part of her still hoping that whatever waited inside might have an explanation gentle enough to let her go back upstairs and pretend the night had never happened. When the latches finally released, she lifted the lid slowly, as if something inside might still be alive, and the smell that rose to meet her, faintly metallic beneath the scent of old leather, told her before her eyes did that this was not a suitcase packed for travel. What she found inside made the room tilt slightly around her. There was the burner phone, its screen cracked in one corner. There was a photograph, old and slightly curled, of Gideon standing beside a man she had never seen before, dated on the back with a year that placed it long before she and Gideon had ever met. There was a thick folder of documents, a man's wristwatch stained dark along the band, an envelope with her name written across it in the same hand as the note, and a small silver drive she recognized as a place to store secrets rather than photographs. She picked up the photograph first, tracing the unfamiliar face beside her husband's, and felt something cold settle in her stomach, the particular dread of realizing a person you love has an entire life you were never invited into. The burner phone powered on with a single video saved to its gallery, and when she pressed play, the screen filled with her husband's face, younger, harder, speaking to the man from the photograph in a voice she barely recognized. He said that she was not to know the truth, and the video ended before she could hear anything more, leaving her staring at a still frame of Gideon's face frozen mid-sentence. She opened the folder next with hands that no longer felt entirely her own, and near the top of the stack, she found a name typed in bold letters that made her breath catch. The man in the photograph, the man in the video, the man her husband had once warned someone to keep her from, was named Corbin Hale, and his name was written on nearly every page that followed. Amara spent what remained of that night learning who Corbin Hale had been, piecing together fragments from the folder like a woman, assembling a stranger out of paper. He had worked as an internal auditor at the company Gideon helped run, a quiet man by every account, meticulous in a way that made him either invaluable or dangerous, depending on what he found. 7 years earlier, he had vanished without warning, and the official record, the one printed in a newspaper clipping tucked near the back of the folder, said he had died in a car accident on a rural stretch of highway outside the city. But the documents inside the suitcase told a different story, one built from memos, financial statements, and handwritten notes suggesting that Corbin had been investigating a secret fund in the months before he disappeared, a fund with threads leading directly back to Gideon. She found a photograph of Corbin's family tucked near the bottom of the folder, a wife and a young daughter standing in front of a modest house, and the ordinariness of that image did more to unsettle her than any of the financial records surrounding it. A man who mattered to people, who had a life outside the version of him reduced to memos and disappearance reports, had walked into a story that eventually swallowed him whole. and Amara found herself wondering whether his wife had ever been given a suitcase of her own, some final warning left behind that no one had thought to open in time. She read through pages of Corbin's handwritten notes, the careful annotations of a man who trusted numbers more than people, watching his suspicion sharpen across the months before his death, from a vague unease into something closer to certainty. In his final entries, dated only weeks before the accident that officially ended his life, he had written a single line that Amara would return to again and again in the days that followed, a note to himself, reminding him to trust no one at the company, not even the people who seemed to be helping him. She turned to the silver drive next, plugging it into an old laptop she kept for nothing important, and watched dozens of encrypted files populate the screen, most of them locked behind passwords she did not have. But one file had been left open, as if deliberately, its name burned into her memory the moment she saw it. It read, Amara Vale Final, and when she opened it, she found herself staring at her own life laid out in exhaustive detail, her home address, her employer, the names of her closest friends, her banking information, and a calendar of her movements, stretching back years before she and Gideon had ever exchanged a word. Somewhere in that quiet garage, at nearly 2 a.m, Amara understood with a clarity that made her sick that her husband had been watching her long before he ever claimed to have met her by chance. Memories she had once treasured began to curdle in her mind as she sat there. She remembered the bookstore, where they had supposedly run into each other twice in the same week, the dinner party where he had appeared at her side exactly when she felt most alone, the countless small moments of comfort he had offered during the hardest year of her career, always arriving precisely when she needed him most. What she had once called fate now looked, in the cold light of the garage, like choreography. Near the bottom of the file list, a second document caught her eye, its title stark against the black background of the screen, reading simply, Project Amara, Phase 3, complete. She did not open it that night. She was not yet ready to know what Phase 4 might contain. By morning, Amara had made only one decision, and it was to trust no one completely, not even the people she had trusted for years. She called Marlo Keene, a lawyer she had known since college, sharp-tongued and unsentimental in exactly the way Amara needed at that moment, and asked her to meet at a coffee shop far from either of their offices. She did not tell Marlo everything. She handed her a partial copy of the documents, careful to leave out anything that pointed too directly at her own fear, and watched her friend's expression shift from curiosity to something closer to alarm as she read. Marlo recognized the pattern almost immediately. The layered shell entities, the offshore routing, the careful distance built between money and the people who moved it, and said quietly that whoever had built this system understood exactly how to hide in plain sight. Together, they traced one of the shell companies to a name that no longer existed, a woman who had died nearly a decade earlier yet whose signature still appeared on transfer documents dated within the last 2 years. That company, they discovered, had sent money to accounts connected to Gideon on at least 4 occasions, but it was the final transfer that made Amara's stomach drop. A sum moved into an account bearing her own name, an account she had never opened and knew nothing about. Marlo set down her coffee and looked at her friend with the particular seriousness of a woman who had spent years learning how these stories usually ended. She said that if an account existed in Amara's name that Amara had never created, then someone, somewhere, was building a story about her, one designed to be believed by people who would never think to ask her version of events. That evening, as Amara sat on her porch trying to decide her next move, her neighbor Nadine Cross crossed the street without being asked, moving with the quiet urgency of someone who had been waiting for the right moment. Nadine lived in the house directly across from theirs, and had always struck Amara as a woman who noticed more than she said, the kind of neighbor who watered her plants at exactly the hour most likely to see everything happening on the block. She told Amara that on the night Gideon disappeared, she had seen a silver car idling in front of their garage sometime after midnight, and that the person behind the wheel had not been Gideon at all. Amara felt the hair rise on her arms as Nadine reached into her cardigan pocket and produced a folded slip of paper, explaining that Gideon himself had come to her door 3 days before that night, asking her to keep it safe. Amara asked what he had told her, and Nadine's voice dropped as though the walls themselves might be listening. He had said only that if something happened to him, she was to give the paper to his wife and to no one else. Nadine admitted, almost apologetically, that she had nearly thrown the note away, certain it was some strange overreaction from a man who always seemed a little too composed for his own good, until the morning after the silver car appeared, when the quiet on their street had felt less like peace and more like something holding its breath. On it was an address on the edge of the city and a single line of handwriting that Amara would read over and over in the days that followed, an instruction to find the place where she and Gideon had first met, as though the beginning of their marriage held the key to understanding its unraveling. Amara asked Nadine, before she turned to leave, whether she had ever suspected anything before that night, and the older woman considered the question for a long moment before answering honestly. She said that in 8 years of watching that house from her porch, she had never once seen Gideon leave without checking the street first, a habit she had always assumed belonged to a cautious man rather than a frightened one, and that it was only now, standing in Amara's doorway with the weight of the folded paper between them, that she understood the difference. The bar where Amara had met Gideon 8 years earlier sat on a quiet corner she had not visited since, and she had always believed, in the sentimental way people believe the stories of their own lives, that their meeting there had been an accident, two strangers reaching for the same seat at a crowded counter. The address Nadine had given her led not to the bar itself, but to a squat brick building 2 doors down, and when Amara and Marlowe pushed through its unlocked side entrance, they found a stairwell leading to a basement that had clearly once served as an office. Empty desks arranged in rows beneath a layer of dust thick enough to soften every footstep. A man was waiting for them there, seated calmly on an overturned crate, as though he had known precisely when they would arrive. He introduced himself as Silas Rowan, a private investigator who had once spent years working corporate security before the work had led him somewhere he could no longer stomach, and he told Amara, without preamble, that this basement had belonged to a surveillance firm Gideon had quietly retained years before their wedding. He gestured toward the rows of empty desks around them, explaining that he had first come to this building nearly 6 years earlier, while chasing a different case entirely, a missing persons file that had led him, quite by accident, into records he was never meant to see, and that he had kept a copy of everything ever since, waiting for the day someone finally walked through that door, asking the right questions. Marlowe asked him directly why he had waited so long to come forward, and Silas answered without any defensiveness, saying simply that evidence without a client willing to use it was just paper, and that for 6 years he had not known a single person brave enough or desperate enough to want the truth more than they wanted their comfortable life left undisturbed. He looked at Amara when he said it, not unkindly, and told her that she was the first person connected to this whole affair who had actually come looking rather than waiting to be told what to believe. Silas explained that Gideon had hired the firm to monitor a small group of individuals, and that Amara's name had appeared on that list long before she ever imagined herself connected to a man like him. The reason, Silas said, had nothing to do with wealth or romance. It had everything to do with her father, who had once worked for a financial conglomerate whose dealings intersected with Gideon's in ways Amara had never been told. She sat very still as Silas slid a worn file across the table between them, its pages containing Gideon's signature, dated 2 full months before the night they had supposedly met by chance at that bar. It was proof, plain and undeniable, that her husband had known who she was long before he ever pretended to discover her. Silas told her flatly that Gideon had not married her by accident, and when Amara asked, in a voice she barely recognized as her own, why he had married her at all, Silas simply looked at her and said that was precisely the thing Gideon had never wanted her to know. Before either of them could say more, an old security camera, mounted in the corner of the room, flickered to life on its own, its lens turning toward them as though someone, somewhere, had been waiting years for this exact moment to press play. On the small monitor beside it, Gideon's face appeared, younger than she had ever known him, his voice steady in a way that made her chest tighten. He said that if Amara was watching this recording, it meant that he had failed, And for a long moment neither Amara, nor Marlowe, nor Silas said anything at all, the three of them frozen in that dusty basement, while a version of Gideon she had never met spoke directly into a future he had clearly feared. The recording continued for nearly 10 minutes, and by the end of it, the story Amara thought she understood had turned itself inside out, Gideon explained, in that same steady voice, that years earlier he had uncovered a laundering network buried inside the company he helped run, one far larger and far more dangerous than anyone outside it could imagine. Corbin Hale had discovered it first, quietly gathering evidence with the same meticulous care that had made him so good at his job, and for that discovery, Corbin had been killed and made to look like the victim of an ordinary accident on an empty highway. Gideon said that after Corbin's death, the people behind the network had made it clear that he had two choices: to work for them or to become the next name in a newspaper obituary, and that he had chosen, out of fear rather than courage, to survive. His voice on the recording caught once, briefly, when he described the night he learned what had truly happened to Corbin, and Amara realized, watching it, that this was the closest she had ever come to seeing her husband afraid on camera, a version of him that the real Gideon had never once allowed her to witness across 8 years of marriage. He said he had tried, in his own broken way, to keep Amara separate from all of it, to build a version of their life together that felt untouched by the danger circling beneath the surface. But then, almost as an afterthought, he admitted something that made Amara's hands go cold around the edge of the table. He confessed that he had first approached the marriage as a means to an end, believing Amara might be holding a document connected to her father's old work, one the network desperately wanted recovered. For a moment, the recorded version of her husband seemed to look directly through the screen and into her eyes, and he said there was something he had never told her, something he had kept from her, even in his own private confession. He said she was not, in fact, the target of these people at all. He said she was the only person alive who could destroy them. Amara did not understand what he meant until 3 days later, when Marlowe noticed a string of numbers etched faintly into the inside band of the blood-stained watch from the suitcase, numbers that turned out to correspond to a safe deposit box at a bank neither of them had ever used. Inside that box, sealed in a manila envelope with her name printed across the front, was the original of a contract Amara had never signed in her life. Yet her signature sat at the bottom of the final page, rendered with a precision that would have fooled anyone who had never watched her sign her own name 1,000 times before. In the days before the story broke, Amara noticed small signs that something around her had shifted, calls from her bank asking her to verify transactions she had never made, a colleague mentioning offhand that someone had phoned the office asking odd questions about her schedule, a letter from an unfamiliar law firm requesting information she did not understand the purpose of. Each incident on its own felt explainable. A clerical error, a wrong number, and it was only in hindsight, once she understood what was coming, that she recognized them as the opening moves of a case being built quietly and methodically against her, brick by brick, long before anyone intended to show her the finished wall. The story broke publicly less than a week later, appearing first as a small item buried in the financial section before growing, within days, into a headline that filled every screen Amara owned. Investigators had opened a case against a major financial firm accused of moving millions of untraceable dollars through a web of shell accounts, and buried within the documents released to the press was Amara's name, listed not as a victim, but as a participant, a woman who had allegedly authorized transfers she had never even heard of before that night, in the garage. The evidence against her was staggering in its completeness. Bank records, forged emails, a contract bearing her signature, each piece fitting into the next with a precision that felt less like coincidence and more like architecture. She understood then, with a clarity that left her hands shaking, exactly what Gideon's warning had meant. If he disappeared or was killed, the entire weight of what had been built around him would settle onto her instead, and every piece of paper had been prepared years in advance to make sure it would. It was in the middle of that unraveling that Elias Voss appeared at her door, dressed as impeccably as always, his voice smooth with the particular sympathy of a man who had rehearsed his lines long before arriving. He had been Gideon's business partner for nearly a decade, a fixture at every dinner party and holiday gathering, and he told Amara now, standing in her own foyer, that Gideon had betrayed her completely, and that he, Elias, was the only person left who could protect her from what was coming. For a moment, exhausted and frightened in a way she had never been before, Amara nearly let herself believe him. But something in the conversation snagged at her attention, a small detail that refused to sit quietly, the fact that Elias had mentioned the suitcase by name, a detail that had never been made public and that only a handful of people could possibly have known. She said nothing to give herself away. Instead, she thanked him for his concern and agreed, with a calm she did not feel, to let him help her, all while a small recorder borrowed from Silas ran quietly in her jacket pocket. Over the following days, she met with Elias twice more, playing the role of a frightened wife grateful for his protection, and on the second occasion, his composure slipped just enough for him to say something he clearly had not meant to say aloud. That Gideon should have handed her over to them long ago and spared everyone the trouble that followed. In that single sentence, Amara understood that her husband had not been the only man in her life capable of betrayal, and that the danger circling her marriage had never belonged to Gideon alone. That night, a text arrived from a number she recognized instantly as Gideon's, though the message itself contradicted everything she thought she knew about where he was. It told her simply that he was alive, and that she was not to trust Elias under any circumstances, a warning that arrived just in time to keep her from making a mistake that might have cost her everything. The coordinates buried inside that message led Amara, 2 nights later, to an abandoned warehouse on the industrial edge of the city, its windows broken and its metal siding rusted through in long orange streaks. She found Gideon inside, slumped against a support beam, his shirt dark with dried blood along one shoulder, and for the first time since the night of the suitcase, she understood that the blood on that lock had truly belonged to him, though he had not died from whatever wound had caused it. He looked up at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something closer to relief than fear, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them heavier than anything either could have said. When words finally came, they came from Amara first, sharp and unforgiving, and she asked him plainly whether he had married her because of some assignment, some mission handed down by people she had never met. Gideon did not deny it. He told her, with a rawness she had never heard from him before, that it had begun exactly that way, but that somewhere in the years that followed, what started as duty had become something he had never expected to feel, and that his love for her, however it had begun, had become real long before that night in the garage. He explained that he had spent years trying to dismantle the network from the inside, working quietly alongside Corbin, gathering the pieces that might one day bring the whole structure down, and that Corbin's death had been the moment he understood how little time he had left before the same fate found him. She asked him, quietly, why he had never simply told her the truth years earlier, sat her down in their own kitchen, and let her decide for herself what kind of life she wanted to live beside him. Gideon looked at her for a long time before answering, and when he did, his voice carried none of the polish she had grown used to over 8 years of marriage. He said that in the beginning, telling her would have meant confessing to a lie so foundational that he was certain she would leave, and that later, once leaving, would have meant losing her entirely. He had told himself the silence was a form of protection rather than what it actually was, which was cowardice dressed up as love. He said he had rehearsed the conversation 100 times in his head, standing in doorways, lying beside her at night, and had never once found the courage to finish it, because some part of him had always known that once she understood what their marriage had truly been built on, she would never look at him the same way again. He told her that the suitcase had not been an accident or a message meant to torment her, but a kind of insurance, a plan built in case he never came home again, a way of making sure that if his own life ended in that warehouse or somewhere like it, the truth would still find its way to her hands. And then he told her the last piece, the one he had clearly been dreading most, that Amara herself was the rightful heir to a fund her father had quietly established decades earlier, a fund containing financial records capable of exposing the entire network from its foundation upward. He admitted that he had married her, at first hoping to locate that fund, but that once he understood, she had no idea it even existed. Something in him had refused to continue the deception, choosing instead, slowly and imperfectly, to protect her rather than betray her. Before Amara could respond, before either of them could say anything more, Gideon's eyes moved toward the shattered windows above them, and he said, in a voice gone suddenly quiet, that they had been watched this entire time. A second later, the last working light in the warehouse died, plunging them both into darkness. What followed happened quickly, though Amara would later remember it in pieces, fragmented like a film reel cut apart and reassembled out of order. Figures moved along the edges of the warehouse, flashlight beams slicing through the dark, and for a moment she believed the story might end there, in that ruined building, with all the truth she had uncovered, dying alongside them. But Amara was no longer the woman who had stood frozen in her garage days earlier, uncertain and afraid. In the time since finding that suitcase, she had copied every file from the silver drive onto 3 separate devices, hidden in 3 separate places. Marlowe had already forwarded a full set of documents to a contact within a federal investigative unit, timed to release automatically if Amara failed to check in by a set hour each day. Silas had spent the previous 2 nights mapping every possible route out of the warehouse district, preparing for exactly the kind of night this had become. Elias arrived, not long after the lights went out, stepping into the beam of his own flashlight with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. His footsteps echoed unhurried across the concrete, and for a moment he simply looked between Amara and the man bleeding quietly against the beam beside her, as though satisfied to find them exactly where he expected. He told Amara she had nowhere left to run, that the story built around her name was airtight, that no jury or journalist would ever question a case constructed with such precision, and that the kindest thing she could do for herself now was to stop fighting a current that had been pulling her under since long before she ever noticed the water rising. But Amara, standing beside her injured husband in the dark, told him calmly that she knew everything: the network, the fund, Corbin's death, the years of surveillance disguised as coincidence, and watched something in Elias's practiced composure begin to crack. His voice rose as he spoke, no longer smooth, no longer rehearsed, and he admitted, in a moment of anger he would later regret, that he had been the one controlling Gideon for years, and that he had personally given the order that ended Corbin Hale's life on that empty highway. Then, almost as an afterthought meant to wound rather than inform, Elias turned to Amara and said that Gideon had never told her the whole truth, not even that night in the warehouse. He told her to ask her husband who had truly placed that suitcase behind the workbench, his voice curling with something close to satisfaction as he watched the question land. Amara turned to Gideon, and for the first time since she had found him bleeding against that support beam, she saw him look away from her, unable to meet her eyes. The silence stretched long enough to feel like its own kind of confession, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. He admitted that he had placed the suitcase there himself, carrying it into the garage in the hours before dinner while she showered upstairs, arranging it with the same careful precision he brought to everything else in his life. But he told her, with an urgency that cut through the fear still clouding the room, that he had not done it to deceive her or frighten her. He had done it because he understood, walking into dinner that night, that he might never walk back out of whatever meeting waited for him afterward. And he had needed to make certain that if the worst happened, the truth would not die with him. Reaching into the inner pocket of his jacket with the hand that was not injured, he pulled out one final drive and pressed it into her palm, telling her, in a voice stripped of every performance he had ever given, that this was the thing he had truly kept hidden from her, the last piece of a story he had never found the courage to tell in full. The final drive, once Marlowe was able to safely access it days later from the security of a federal field office, contained the entire architecture of the network laid bare, names cross-referenced with account numbers, years of recorded conversations, transaction histories stretching back further than Amara had imagined possible, and buried among it all, clear documentation of what had truly happened to Corbin Hale. It also contained, carefully organized in its own folder, every piece of evidence proving that Amara herself had never authorized a single transfer, had never signed a single contract, had never known that any of it existed until the night her husband's blood dried on a suitcase lock behind his workbench. Marlowe handed the full set of files to the investigators within hours of receiving them, and the response moved faster than Amara had expected, faster than she had allowed herself to hope. Elias Voss was arrested at his own front door 2 days later, and in the weeks that followed, a slow but steady collapse spread through the network he had helped build, names falling one after another as investigators traced the money back through every shell company and false signature. Gideon did not escape the consequences of his own choices, however complicated they had become, and he spent long hours in rooms with lawyers and federal agents, answering for years spent inside a system he had once tried, however imperfectly, to dismantle from within. Amara did not forgive him quickly, and she made no apology for that. There were nights she sat across the kitchen table from him, in a silence neither of them tried to fill, and evenings she left the house simply to be somewhere he was not, needing distance more than she needed answers. When she finally spoke to him honestly about what remained of their marriage, she told him plainly that he might love her, that she even believed, after everything, that he did, but that love did not erase 8 years spent inside a life he had quietly engineered around her without her knowledge or consent. Gideon did not argue with her. He told her only that he did not expect her forgiveness, that he had stopped hoping for it somewhere in that dark warehouse, and that all he truly wanted now was for her to live the rest of her life without ever having to be afraid of him again. The months that followed were slower than Amara expected, filled with legal proceedings and quiet, unglamorous rebuilding rather than any dramatic conclusion. She returned to work gradually, rebuilt her friendship with Marlowe on steadier ground, and found herself, for the first time in nearly a decade, making decisions that belonged entirely to her, unshaped by a husband's careful hand, guiding her from somewhere just out of sight. She was no longer the woman who had once mistaken control for devotion. She had become someone who examined every choice before she made it, someone who trusted herself first and everyone else only afterward. And there was a kind of quiet strength in that transformation that she had never expected grief and betrayal to produce. She moved out of the house they had shared, not because any court required it of her, but because she found she could no longer sleep easily inside rooms. Gideon had chosen the furniture for, the paint for, the very angle of the windows for. The apartment she found instead was smaller and plainer than anything she had lived in since her 20s, and she furnished it slowly, piece by piece, choosing every lamp and chair herself, learning again what it felt like to want something without first considering what someone else might think of the choice. Marlowe helped her carry boxes on the day she moved in, and somewhere between the second and third trip up the stairs, the two women found themselves laughing over nothing in particular for the first time in what felt like years, a small, ordinary sound that Amara had not realized she missed until she heard it again. Silas checked in occasionally, in the months that followed, never intrusive, always brief, a man who seemed to understand that some people needed to be watched over quietly, rather than reminded constantly of what they had survived, and Amara found she did not mind his presence at the edges of her new life the way she once might have minded anyone standing too close. Gideon wrote to her sometimes, careful letters rather than phone calls, respecting a distance she had asked for without ever having to explain it twice. She did not answer most of them, though she read every one, and in the space of those unanswered pages, she slowly began to separate the man who had lied to her for years from the man who had, in the end, chosen to hand her the truth, even when it cost him everything he had built to protect himself. It was not forgiveness, not yet, and she was careful never to call it that. But it was something quieter and more honest, a willingness to let his letters exist without needing to erase them or answer them either. One evening, nearly a year after the night the suitcase first appeared behind Gideon's workbench, Amara found it again, stored now in the back of a closet where she had placed it, and mostly tried to forget it. Her name was still written across the top in the same block letters, though the blood that once stained the lock had long since been cleaned away, leaving only a faint discoloration in the leather that no one but her would ever notice. She carried it into the living room and opened it one final time, And where dozens of documents and devices had once filled its interior, there was now only a single folded piece of paper resting at the bottom, left there by Gideon, in the last conversation they had shared as husband and wife, before everything between them changed permanently. She unfolded it slowly and read the words written in his familiar hand. A short line explaining that the first time he had ever met her, he had done so, carrying a mission he had never chosen for himself, and that the last time he had truly looked at her, in that ruined warehouse with the lights dying around them, all he had wanted was for her to be free. There was no signature beneath it, no closing line asking for anything in return, as though even in this last message, he had understood that he had already asked too much of her for one lifetime. Amara read the note twice, then folded it carefully along its original creases and set it back inside the empty suitcase. She did not cry, and she did not look back toward the closet where she would eventually store it again, perhaps for the last time. She simply stood, closed the lid, and walked out of the room and into whatever remained of her own life, carrying nothing with her that she had not chosen to keep. Some marriages begin with a lie so carefully built that the person living inside it never sees its edges until the night everything collapses at once. But sometimes, if she is patient enough and sharp enough, and refuses to look away from what frightens her most, the woman who survives that lie becomes the only one strong enough to stand in the wreckage of it and tell the truth herself.